Hey, what's going on everyone? Nick here with HN Entertainment's Ending Explained for Avengers Endgame. So obviously, major spoilers here. If you guys don't want to get spoiled, go see Endgame because it's an amazing film, and come back and we can break down that very dramatic, impactful ending. So without further ado, here we go. During the final act of Avengers Endgame, we see the remaining Avengers alongside the characters who were dusted that have come back fight against Thanos' army, which now includes the Black Order and the Outriders. The entire battle takes place in the ruins around Avengers headquarters in upstate New York, after Thanos from 2014 caught wind of what the Avengers were planning, going back in time, getting the stones, and reversing what had been done. He decides to use the Pym particles that old Nebula stole from the new Nebula to go forward in time and make his universe happen. And essentially what ends up happening is that during the final battle, Tony actually gets a hold of all of the Infinity Stones and snaps his fingers, dusting Thanos and his army. What's interesting about this is throughout the final battle, throughout the final act, Doctor Strange, who has now returned from the Soul World, tells Tony that there is still only one way that they win, but he can't tell him what it is beforehand, otherwise it won't happen, thus foreshadowing Tony's sacrifice. The Avengers all hold a funeral for him, which is attended by the Guardians of the Galaxy and pretty much every major character in the MCU, including some characters that we haven't seen in a while, like Harley Keener from Iron Man 3, who's now a lot older. That is a possible hint that Harley could join the Young Avengers as Iron Lad or something like that in the future. Now, right after the funeral, while the heroes are still sort of sitting around at the lakeside, we catch up on Clint Barton and Wanda Maximoff, who are kind of next to each other by the lake and talking about the characters that were most close to them and how they're still gone for good. Clint talks about how he wishes Natasha could have known that they won and that her sacrifice was worth something, to which Wanda replies she knows and so does he, implying the Vision. We all know that Vision died in the events of Infinity War when Thanos pulled the Mind Stone out of his head, but we also know that Disney and Marvel are planning a limited series called WandaVision for Disney+. Now, we don't know what the show is going to tackle just yet, but there have been a lot of hints, including concept art that was shown at the Disney Investor Day, which could reference or allude to a version of House of M and the Vision comic book series by Tom King. Basically, it's going to be an amalgam of those stories in which it looks like Wanda is going to try to create her own perfect dream world, but things are going to go horribly wrong. The other interesting thing is that Natasha, aka the Black Widow, is still dead for good, meaning that her planned Phase 4 solo movie will likely be a prequel exploring her origins with the Red Room training program and how she became the Black Widow. Now, whether or not audiences will be into that remains to be seen, because people really didn't gravitate towards Solo, which sounds like a pretty similar situation in that Harrison Ford's Han Solo was killed off in The Force Awakens, but yet right after that they decided to do a young Han Solo prequel movie showing how he came to be. Next up, we have the revelation that Thor actually leaves New Asgard and goes to join the Guardians of the Galaxy, who are now searching for Gamora from 2014, who's out there freely exploring the galaxy. That's going to provide a very interesting plot element should they decide to use that for Guardians of the Galaxy 3, because now Thor is on the roster and they actually have a version of Gamora back who was killed off in Infinity War, but this is a version that hadn't actually met the Guardians yet, so she's gonna have to familiarize herself with them all over again, which should be really interesting to see. Before Thor leaves though, he does give command and leadership of New Asgard to Valkyrie, who's now the Queen, which could potentially set up a new Thor 4 in which Valkyrie takes over the mantle or something like that, which has been actually pitched according to Tessa Thompson herself very recently. The next revelation is that Hawkeye returns to his family, and it seems like at some point after the events of Endgame, he'll run across Kate Bishop. It was recently reported from Variety that Hawkeye is getting his own limited series on Disney+, in which he'll come out of retirement to train young archer Kate Bishop, who eventually takes over the mantle of Hawkeye and joins the Young Avengers. Speaking of Young Avengers, now that Cassie Lang is a lot older in this timeline due to the 5 years passing from when Scott got trapped in the quantum realm and Thanos snapped his fingers, leading to the decimation event, we now see that Cassie could potentially become Stature in the Young Avengers because she's much older. It's presumed that she is going to train under Scott and Hope, who are now back living at home as a family. There's also a brief tease of T'Challa, Shuri, and Okoye back in Wakanda, setting up the events of Black Panther 2. We then see Peter return back to school and reunite with Ned, who looks like he hasn't seen him in 5 years. Now, there's an interesting thing here because Ned actually hasn't aged, or at least he doesn't look like he's aged, and neither has Peter, so there's a chance that both of them were actually dusted during the decimation event in Infinity War, and this is kind of a very emotional moment because it's like two friends reuniting after years away. Next up, we see Pepper, Happy, Morgan, and Rhodes all watching a video message that Tony recorded pretty much moments before they decided to go through with the time travel thing. And it's a pretty emotional moment because it's basically the last message that they're going to be getting from Tony after his death. Now, I thought this was pretty cool because it is kind of a nod and reference to the comics when Riri Williams took over the mantle of Iron Man and became Iron Heart. She had like a holographic version of Tony with her, so I thought that was a cool kind of nod to the comics. Who knows if that's going to actually be a thing in the MCU going forward. More likely it's not going to be, but a cool reference nonetheless. Now, the most important thing, in my opinion, that happens is with Steve Rogers, Bucky, Falcon, and the Hulk at the very last moments of the film. Since the Hulk has a damaged arm from using the Infinity Gauntlet to bring back our dusted heroes, he's helping Steve travel back in time to take the Infinity Stones back to their rightful spots. He says goodbye to Bucky and Sam, and Bruce activates the machine, in which they all wait for his return, but nothing happens. There's a slight pause, and then we see Bucky actually spot an older man who's sitting off by the lake, looking out in the distance. Sam Wilson walks up to him, and it turns out to be an older version of Steve Rogers. Steve tells him that after he returned the stones to their rightful spots, he went and had some of that life that Tony always told him about, and actually settled down with Peggy back in the 1950s. He then passes off his shield to Sam Wilson, who's going to take up the mantle, presumably of Captain America in the new timeline. This is setting up the events of the Falcon and Winter Soldier series coming to Disney+, in which it'll likely revolve around Falcon learning to take on the mantle of Captain America, with Bucky alongside of him and maybe some new spy or international things going on, which should be really cool to see. One other important thing that Banner mentions before Steve goes back in time is that if he does not return the stones to their rightful spots, he can create some nasty alternate realities. So that could be pretty cool if the MCU ever does multiverse stuff, which is pretty likely if they'll ever do Secret Wars or something as a big mega crossover down the line. But what are your guys' thoughts on the ending to Avengers Endgame? There's certainly a lot more to dissect in the movie, as, you know, there was tons of hints and references and Easter eggs, but also exploring previous films in a new light. I think the biggest takeaways are Sam Wilson taking over as Captain America rather than Bucky, which is a thing that happened more recently in the comics. I want to say around like 2014 or 2015 when Sam Wilson Captain America came out. It was a very interesting story, and I actually am kind of glad they went with that direction because I think Bucky is better served as the Winter Soldier, at least for now in the MCU, and Sam Wilson seems like the right candidate to take over for Captain America. Now, the other interesting thing for me was also to see Thor joining the Guardians of the Galaxy, which means that James Gunn, who is currently working on Guardians 3 after he wraps up the Suicide Squad, is likely going to have to rework his story ideas for Guardians 3 now that Thor has been thrown into the mix and a new version of Gamora. It remains to be seen what plotline he goes with because they also introduced Adam Warlock at the end of Volume 2, so there are a lot of very interesting avenues that Gunn could go with. But like I said, post all your thoughts down in the usual spot. What are your thoughts on how Avengers Endgame ended and all the stuff it set up for Phase 4? For more updates on Avengers Endgame and everything at Marvel and pop culture, be sure to subscribe to HN Entertainment.